Thank you, thank you. So let's try that again. Good morning. And thank you, Bishop Anderson, for warming up the crowd. I must say I got to get my little clicker here, technology. Here we go. I must say that last night we had a great time in conversation. It was good to be able to share with you and to be here. And it was great to hear feedback afterwards with some conversations. But I must tell you, you folks make it hard on a speaker. I need a little bit more feedback, a little bit more love here, okay? So I was talking with Bishop Anderson and folks from the Synod last night, and I said, okay, you know, I'm feeling like I got to tell a Lena and Ollie joke, okay? Just to fit in. So they say, you probably know this one, that Ollie loved Lena so much, he almost told her. So I need you to tell me, okay? So if you like what I'm saying, if you're agreeing with me, if it resonates for you, give me an amen out there, an amen. Shout it out, right? There we go, okay. Kind of pull it a little bit. If you don't like what I'm saying, if you disagree, if it doesn't reflect your reality and what you're thinking about, challenge it a bit. Let me know. That's going to be hard for Norwegians and Swedes and the rest of us, right? So you can be like my mother-in-law's sister, who always says, all for different. Yeah, so you can just go with that, okay? What we've been talking about today, yesterday, and over this weekend a little bit is this idea that we live on the move. And we started out last night by looking at one of the many biblical stories that focus on people when they are in a moment of transition. And we talked about the history or the story of Joseph, his relationship with his brothers, how an unequal distribution of resources within the family led to dispute that eventually drove Joseph out. And he, like people before him and since, followed the trade and ended up in Egypt. When his brothers were hungry because there was no food in the land, they too got on the train and went following the trade to Egypt. And that's where we had left this story yesterday. Today, I want us to think a little bit more about this, to keep these images of both the pull and the push of migration, the things that invite us, that attract us to a new opportunity, as well as the push that sometimes forces us to go and search for a new place to live, sometimes leaving behind lots of what we love and care deeply for. So let's pick up a little bit of the story of Joseph. So now we are at the point in which Joseph's brothers have come to Egypt. Joseph has been transformed so much by his experience abroad that when his brothers encounter him, they don't even recognize him anymore. It's like some of you who've sent kids off to college, you know, and they come back at Thanksgiving, and you're like, who are you and what did you do with my kid, right? Because you just made them the best lasagna that they love, and they tell you, sorry, Mom, I'm vegan. So Joseph had turned vegan, whatever else he did, to the point that his brothers could not recognize him in Egypt. They stand before him in closed room with all the doors closed, and they still have no idea who this guy is, in part because of their own fear. So this is what Joseph says to them. This is Genesis 45. Well, there we go. Then Joseph could no longer control himself. You know, if he had been Norwegian or Swede, he could have. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So he drives everybody out. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Here is a moment of coming clean, of speaking truth. Joseph closes the doors, creates a bubble, a space in the middle of all the expectations. As the second in command, he cannot show a lot of emotion. He cannot show brokenness. So he drives everybody out, creates a little space of trust where he can come clean and speak the reality that is in his heart. And he wept loudly. So loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive. The grief in this scene is overwhelming. Joseph says, I am Joseph. He knows who he has become. He has become as successful as an immigrant possibly could. This is Kissinger, for those of you who remember Kissinger, right? I mean, as far as you can get as a foreigner, because you can't run for president if you were born abroad, but in control and in command. But even though he has become as successful as an immigrant possibly can, second in command only to the Pharaoh, Joseph's life is not complete without him reconciling to his own background, to who he truly is, to his roots. So the first question that you know has been lingering in his mind as he succeeded throughout his life, as he sat in jail, as he lived in Potiphar's house, as he went through all of these different experiences, in the back of his mind, at the tip of his tongue was this question that came out the moment he could finally come clear: is my father still alive? No matter how successful he has become, he needs to reconcile himself to his past. The biblical story often reminds us that if we want to know where we are going, we must know where we come from. If any of you have been lectors at church, and then, you always pray that you're not going to get one of those genealogy passages, right? With all those funky names that go on and on. Why do they put those in the Bible? Why do important books begin with it? I mean, the editor should have known, right? It's not going to sell if you begin the New Testament with a list of names nobody can pronounce. That's how the New Testament begins, in the book of Matthew. But it does so just like the book of Exodus will as soon as the Joseph story is done. Because if we want to know where we are going, we must know where we have come from. And so we begin by remembering the names of those who are important to us. In your pre-assembly package, you received a couple of sheets of paper that help us to remember. That we remember those who have gone before us. Those on whose shoulders we build our work and our ministry and our life. The people whose stories can help inspire and inform the ministries that we do. And as you read through those few pages in the lives of these 4 individuals in this synod who are remembered there, you see their stories as stories of migration, of the places where they have served the church across the region, where they have moved faithfully even beyond the boundaries of this country because of their own sense of call. If you want to know where you are going, you must know where you have come from. For those of us who have the blessing of working on behalf of the church and for the church and with the church in higher education, we work with immigrants. If you think about all of our residential colleges, most of the 26 ELCA colleges are residential liberal arts schools. We bring most of our students onto campus, so they migrate physically. They come to our communities for 4 years, leaving behind their communities, their families, their customs. Is the very first time, or for some of them the only time, when moving voluntarily represents losing, going from one nice room to yourself to having to share a tiny little room with somebody. But as they move and they come to this community, they're also migrating into adulthood. Their experience of migration is not just a physical one where they must readapt to a new place and let go of something dear behind, but it is also the migration into a new world of adulthood, a world that is extremely complicated. And like any other immigrant, they must figure out a way to move forward and acquire new knowledge, the language of their chosen profession, the new values and customs that they will encounter. But they also have to decide which of those they will adapt and take on, and which of the things from their past they will retain or let go of. In order to move forward, our students must know where they have come from. And that's where the ministry of the church, before they are sent off on the move, is critically important, so that they know who they are and whose they are. In order to move forward, they must know where they have come, but they must also realize that we are told the stories of those who have come before us to the extent that they were forward-looking themselves. In the Bible, we hear in Hebrews 11, a passage that begins, many of us are familiar with it, where it tells us what faith is. Faith is the belief or the trust, the commitment, the loyalty of the things not seen, the hope of things we haven't yet achieved. And then it begins with this litany that sounds very much like a genealogy, that begins with Adam and Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Isaac. And it tells us all of these stories of people who have gone before us in the faith. But the refrain in that chapter 11 is that they died without having accomplished that for which they had set out. We are reminded in chapter 11 of Hebrews, when we are being told what faith is and what people of faith are about, that all of these, we are told, died in faith without having received the promises. But from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. Brothers and sisters, the Bible tells us that if you want to know what it means to be a person of faith, you need to understand what it means to be a sojourner, a stranger, a foreigner. That's who we are. That's what it means to be a person of faith. That's what it means to be a person that believes that our life is not all just here, but that while we begin here, our life, our fulfillment is elsewhere. That we connect both to our past so that it informs and inspires us, but it does not limit us. Instead, we are a people who look back knowing that we can move confidently forward into where God has called us. The book of Deuteronomy, the word Deuteronomy means kind of like the second law. And it's one of the kind of like the revisions that Moses does before the people of Israel go into the promised land. And the key that he gives them to understanding the stories they have heard, the ones we've been looking at, Joseph, Abraham, all of these stories. The key he gives them to understand those stories is, he says to them, remember that you were strangers in Egypt. So it is important that we know this about ourselves. We could do this with the little pads, but we're going to do it by an old-fashioned voting method here. So take a moment to think for yourself about the number of moves you have experienced in your life. Okay, so try to make a list. Some of you might need pen and pencil, it might get long. But how many addresses you've had, or how many moves have you had in your life? So take a moment for yourself to think about this. Now, by a show of hands, raise your hand if you are still living in the same place where you were born and raised. All right, I think there's about 5, 6, maybe 10 if I can't count quite right. So, all right. How about how many of you have moved 2 to 3 times in your life? We're getting a few more. All right, how about 3 to 5 times? So that seems to be about the majority. And more than 5 times. Oh my. Okay, that's the majority. I don't think we need a recount. It's pretty obvious. Most of us have moved more than 5 times. This is in Southwestern Minnesota, right? Where everybody just lives where they grew up. Maybe not. Maybe the reality of being on the move is not limited to those who cross a national border because of escaping violence or poverty or pursuing a dream. Perhaps those on the move are not only the people we sometimes don't know what to do with when it comes to our political approaches. The reality is that we've had, as we said yesterday, a huge increase because of a variety of factors, including the way we do business, the way we trade. We've had an incredible increase in the ability and opportunity for many people to move, and the need for many people to move. So mobility and trade are way on the increase. If you have a U.S. passport, if you travel with a U.S. passport, if you're a U.S. citizen, you can travel to 195 countries without asking for permission. If you can afford the ticket or the ride, however you're going to get there, you don't even have to ask for permission. You take your passport, you fill out some paperwork on the airplane, and you can go to most of the world. This is unprecedented. Never in history have we had that ability. If, however, you travel with a passport, say from Guatemala or from other parts of the world, your ability to move is significantly and seriously limited. Yesterday I told the story of Rosa, who followed the trade coming north. But her experience is like millions of others who are desperate to partake in this increased mobility and globalization and the opportunities it brings about, but for whom those opportunities have increasingly been reduced. So that at the same time that we have increased mobility and trade, the opportunity of some, particularly the desperately poor, to move has been increasingly restricted. That's where we find ourselves today in terms of our dealings with the stranger among us. Today in the United States, there are an estimated 11 million people who are undocumented in this country. I'm not sure if you can grasp that number. I can't. But it helps me to think about the fact that that's the entire population of Iowa, Minnesota, and half of Wisconsin put together. Okay? That's what 11 million people means, who are living among us in the shadows. Now, we could determine that all 11 million of them are just a bunch of, people who don't respect the law and just want to break the law because they are more immoral people. Or we can do what Jesus has asked us to do and say, what things? What's going on here? We have it in our traditions, in our own history, in our own life experience to know a little bit about this. We know it from our own history. This is a painting where I live in Decorah, is Vesterheim Museum. I don't know how many of you have been to Vesterheim. This is the Norwegian American History Museum, and is their migration is their focus. And this is a painting that's, as you come into the room, I don't think you can see it quite as well on here, but I encourage you to look it up online. The name of this painting is Grace Before the Meal, and it is by a well-known artist. Many of the altar pieces in our area were done by Herbjørn Gausta. And in this painting, you see a family sitting at the table for grace. But if you look closely, you notice that there is an empty space at the table and someone is missing. In the story that the painting tells, the one missing is the father who has migrated from Norway to America out of both need and the hope of opportunity. But left behind is a family that has no idea what has happened to this person. And it may be months before they hear from them. The reality of migration is not just of opportunity. There's also significant loss. When people are on the move, it means that they are leaving somewhere. The migration may affect people and areas in different ways. This is a map of Minnesota, and it indicates population change by county in the last decade, so between the census of 2000 and 2010. As you think about the ministry of your congregations and the reality of mobility we have acknowledged by just raising our hands, you know that mobility is impacting the Southwestern Minnesota Synod territory in ways that are really real. Out of all the counties in the Synod, only 5 of them experienced growth in the last census measure. The rest of them lost population. So, we are a people of faith who are told that what it means to be human, what it means to be a person of faith, is to be a stranger, a sojourner, a person on the move. We know that we live with increased mobility around us and in the world. But what we also must know is that in our scriptures, we live and believe in a God who knows about the turbulence of moving al otro lado, to the other side. Throughout his ministry, Jesus kept pushing his disciples to go to the other side, knowing that when they did, they might run across a storm on the way. It might feel as if God had fallen asleep at the wheel when the storms would rise and threaten us. When mobility begins to disorient us, when we begin to feel that empty space in our church, in our home, in our communities, the first thing that we need to do is to have the courage to know that we are in an environment where we can come clean like Joseph did. Can our churches be that space where we can weep and wail as needed, where we can acknowledge those questions that burn deep within us. Is my Father still alive? Does my congregation have a future? Does my community, will my children do well as they head off into another state, into a new city, into the big city? Can our churches be the place that understand that we are a people on the move and can acknowledge that without fear and name it? Knowing that we believe in a God like those who have gone before us, who died in faith. Knowing that we can offer a world on the move the good news of Jesus Christ. The good news of a God that every time God has an encounter with a human being, everywhere in the Bible, the first words that come out of the angel or whatever, the burning bush, are, do not be afraid. Do not fear. Brothers and sisters, mobility is real. It's what's happening. But Jesus invites us to ask these questions and to sit together and begins to open up for us the scriptures so that they may inform, inspire, and shape the way we look at the things that are happening today. Amen.
Thank you, David. I just want to go back to a moment that was stunning to me. In our self-understanding, we think we are very stable people, but in reality, 10 or 12 people in this room have lived in the home that they grew up in, and the rest of us have migrated. I think I'm over 20 different moves. That's just an amazing insight.